In this town, you are born twice. The first time is a mistake of nature. The second time, if you are smart enough, if you are hungry enough, if you are willing to do what the ones who disappeared were not willing to do, the second time is a masterpiece. I was not a girl from a difficult background who got lucky in Hollywood. I was an architect. I looked at what Hollywood wanted and I built it. I looked at what Hollywood feared and I buried it. I looked at what happened to the weak ones, the ones who cried when the cameras stopped, the ones who believed the studio when it told them they were loved, and I made a decision. I would never be a victim. I would be a monument. And for 40 years of photographs and films and contracts and feuds and reinventions and comebacks and the specific, exhausting, never-ending performance of being the person I had decided to be, I was exactly that, a monument. Monuments are cold, and they are built on silence. And the woman I buried to build one never entirely stopped making noise. This is what it costs to survive Hollywood. Let me tell you about the first version. The girl before the architect. She was born poor. Genuinely, structurally poor. The kind of poor that is not a temporary condition but a permanent address. A set of assumptions about what is possible that the people around you have already accepted and expect you to accept too. The town she grew up in was the kind of town that produces two kinds of people. The ones who stay and build their lives inside the limits of what the town considers possible. Decent lives, real lives. Lives with their own quiet dignity that I am not dismissing. And the ones who look at those limits and feel something that is not quite anger and not quite ambition, but something in between. Something that says, not this. Not this town. Not this ceiling. Not these choices dressed up as the only choices. I felt that thing early. I cannot tell you exactly when it started. I do not think it started precisely. I think I was born with it. But I can tell you that by the time I was old enough to understand what options existed and what options did not, I had already made the only decision that would ever matter. I was leaving. Not the town specifically, the life the town represented. The version of myself that the town had already written a future for without asking me whether I wanted it, with complete precision. The mechanism was this. I watched. From the time I was old enough to understand that the world was organized in a specific way, that some people had access to things that other people did not have access to, and that the difference between the two groups was not talent or intelligence or worthiness, but something more arbitrary and more mutable. From that time, I watched the people who had what I wanted, and I studied how they moved, how they stood, how they entered a room, how they spoke, and what they wore, and what they chose not to say, and how they held their bodies in the specific way that communicated, without words, that they were the kind of person who belonged in every room they entered. Not born to it. Not entitled to it. Just absolutely, completely certain of it. That certainty, I understood, was learnable. It was not a quality people were born with. It was a performance so well rehearsed that the performer had forgotten it was a performance. And if it could be forgotten into, it could be practiced into. I practiced. Something harder entering. Hollywood found me, or I found Hollywood, the sequence matters less than the result, when I was young enough that the studio could still shape me. And the studio was very good at shaping. That is what studios did in those years. They were not in the business of discovering people. They were in the business of manufacturing them. They took raw material, girls from difficult backgrounds, girls with talent and ambition and the specific hunger that comes from knowing exactly what you don't have. And they processed it. They gave you a name. A new one, usually. Something that read better on a marquee, something without the weight of wherever you came from. They shaped your eyebrows and your hairline and your cheekbones, not metaphorically, literally, with the very specific tools of the studio makeup and hair departments, which were, in those years, among the most skilled and least credited operations in the entire industry. They decided what kind of star you would be, what genre, what audience, what image, and they built the publicity machine around that decision, and they repeated the machine until the public believed it, and then they believed it themselves. Most girls let the studio do this to them. They arrived eager and grateful, and they handed themselves over, their names, their images, their public identities, to the studio's judgment, trusting that the people who had built the system understood how to use them within it. I used the studio to do it for me. I handed nothing over. I watched what the studio was building, and I built it faster and better myself. And I arrived at the meetings with my own ideas about what I should be that were usually more interesting than the ideas the studio had because I was starting from the inside, and they were starting from the outside. And I knew something they could never entirely know. I knew what I was made of. And what I was made of was considerably more than what showed on the surface. The distinction between being shaped and doing the shaping, that distinction is everything. It is the difference between a career that belongs to you and a career that is borrowed. I was not interested in borrowed. I want to talk about the work, not the films. The films are documented, anyone can watch them, the performances are preserved on celluloid and speak for themselves. But the work that happened before the cameras rolled. The work that most actresses either didn't know needed to be done or weren't willing to do. The body was a project. I want you to understand what I mean by that, not that I was dissatisfied with what nature had provided, but that I understood the body as an instrument, the way a concert pianist understands the instrument, not the piano that was given to them, the piano they have built through years of practice and adjustment into exactly the instrument their music requires. I approached the body the way an engineer approaches a structural problem, identifying what needed to change and changing it without sentiment, without the indulgence of finding the process unpleasant, without the vanity of believing that what I had been given was already sufficient. Nothing is ever already sufficient. That belief is where careers go to stop. The posture came first. I understood earlier than most actresses understood this, that the camera reads the body before it reads the face. That how a woman carries herself across a room, how she arrives at a mark, how she holds the specific geometry of her shoulders and her spine in the 2 seconds before she speaks, all of that communicates something that no amount of acting technique can override. The audience reads the body. They read it before they know they're reading it. And what the body says in those first 2 seconds determines whether the audience leans forward or sits back. I needed them to lean forward, always, in every scene, from the first frame to the last. So I worked on the posture with the same intensity I worked on everything. Every morning, every day of every year of the career that the studio was building, and I was building faster. The shoes. People always mention the shoes. And yes, the shoes were part of it. Heels that were not comfortable, heels that required a specific kind of muscular engagement through the arch, the ankle, the calf, that produced, when maintained consistently, the posture I required. Not the posture the shoes required. The posture I had decided on and was using the shoes to achieve. I wore them until the posture was permanent, until my body had learned what I needed it to know and no longer required the instruction. Pain is information. If you are willing to receive it as information rather than as suffering, if you can hold the discomfort and ask what it is telling you rather than simply wanting it to stop, it tells you what needs to change and how much further you have to go. I was always willing to receive it as information. The face was next. The eyebrows, the painted lip, the specific architecture of a face designed to read in black and white under the specific conditions of studio lighting in the 1930s. This is a technical problem that most people do not appreciate as the technical problem it is. Film stock in those years had particular properties. It read certain colors and tones in ways that daylight does not read them. A face that was beautiful in a room could be flat and characterless on screen. A face that was ordinary in a room could be extraordinary on screen, if you understood the technology and you made your choices accordingly. I understood the technology. I studied photographs of myself with the same analytical attention a general gives to military maps. Where the light fell wrong, where the angle was unfavorable, what needed to be adjusted before the next session. Not just corrected after, but anticipated and prevented. The studio had people for this. Excellent people, in many cases. Skilled technicians who understood the equipment and the film stock and the lighting and how to use all three together. I also had my own opinions. My opinions were usually right. This was not always appreciated. Directors who had worked with more compliant actresses sometimes found my opinions inconvenient. I found their inconvenience less important than the quality of the result. We usually reached an accommodation. The obsession with cleanliness came from the same place: control. I want to be honest about this because it has been written about in ways that make it sound like disorder, like something that needed to be fixed. And that framing is wrong. It was not disorder. It was the opposite of disorder. The apartment was immaculate. Always, at every stage of my life, regardless of what else was happening, what professional crisis was unfolding, what personal situation was deteriorating, what the industry was doing or not doing, the space I lived in was organized to a standard that my staff understood was not negotiable, and was not about them, and was not a reflection of any judgment of their abilities. It was a requirement. My requirement. for a reason that I understood and did not particularly need to explain to anyone. When everything else is uncertain, when the career is subject to the decisions of studios and directors and the unpredictable responses of audiences and the shifting fashions of an industry that has the attention span of a very successful, very distracted child, when all of that is beyond your control, and it is always beyond your control no matter how well you manage it, you need something that isn't. You need a room where every object is where you put it, where the standard is your standard, where what you decide is what happens. People found this excessive. People who found it excessive had never lived without control of their immediate environment and could not understand what it felt like to need that control the way you need air. I needed it. I had always needed it. From the first room I had ever had to myself, the first space that was mine, I had kept it the way I needed it to be. And I was not going to apologize for that to people who had always had enough space to be careless in. By the early 1930s, I was a star. Not a promising newcomer, not a studio investment still being developed, not a name they were testing to see whether it would stick. A star, with the specific meaning that word had in old Hollywood. A face that put people in seats. A name above the title. A commercial quantity that the studio's entire machinery organized itself around. The publicity department, the photography, the loan-out negotiations. The careful management of a public image that was by this point one of the most valuable pieces of intellectual property the studio owned. And they knew it was valuable. And I knew it was valuable. And the relationship between those two facts was for many years the defining tension of my professional life. I had built this. I want to be very clear about that. The studio had provided the infrastructure, like the films, the promotional apparatus, the distribution, the machinery for converting talent and image into commercial product. But the raw material of the star had been built by me. Before I ever walked through the studio gates, in the years of watching and studying and practicing and correcting that no one saw because no one was invited to see, the fan mail came by the thousands. Thousands of letters every week from people across the country, people who had watched the films and felt something and needed to communicate that feeling to someone who might understand. I answered it. Not because the studio required it, though the studio did appreciate it and mentioned it in the publicity materials and used it as evidence of the specific kind of relationship I had with the audience, but because I understood something that many of my contemporaries did not. The audience was not an abstraction. The audience was not a demographic or a market segment or a statistical projection that the studio's financial department used to decide whether to greenlight a picture. The audience was people. Specific people. With specific lives in specific towns across the country, towns not entirely unlike the town I had come from, who had made a choice to spend their money and their evening watching something I had made. Every letter was one of those people reaching across the distance between their life and mine and saying, "I saw you. I felt that. Thank you." That person deserved a response. Not a form letter. Not a signed photograph from a machine that replicated my signature and went out by the hundreds. A response. And the response, the real response, the one that took the time it took, built something that no studio campaign could build and no publicity department could manufacture. Loyalty. Real loyalty. The kind that survives a bad picture. The kind that survives a difficult period when the studio has decided it is no longer certain about your commercial value. The kind that survives the years when the critics have moved on to whoever is newer and the industry is watching to see whether you can survive your own success. I had built my audience directly, person by person, letter by letter, which meant the studio could not take the audience away from me when it decided it was done with me. They could take the contract, they could take the films, they could take the whole apparatus they had built around the name they had given me. But the audience was mine, and the studio would decide it was done with me. That much I had always known. They always do. Everyone's commercial value expires eventually. That is the mathematics of the industry, as certain as any other kind, and the only question is what you have built that the studio cannot take with it when it walks away. I had built that. The audience was mine. More deliberately. But there were other things I built in those years that were less clean in the construction. Alliances, the kind that required maintenance. The kind that required attention to what was being said about you in rooms you were not in, by people whose goodwill you needed, and whose enmity you could not afford. Information was the currency of old Hollywood. Everyone knew this. The smart ones operated accordingly. The less smart ones discovered it when the information had already done its damage. I was very smart. I understood who was talking to whom and what the value of different relationships was in different contexts. I understood which conversations were more important than they appeared to be, and which appeared important but could be safely ignored. I understood the system, not with the resigned understanding of someone who knows they are trapped in it, with the operational understanding of someone who intends to use it. The kind that survives a bad picture. The kind that survives a difficult period when the studio has decided it is no longer certain about your commercial value. The kind that survives the years when the critics have moved on to whoever is newer, and the industry is watching to see whether you can survive your own success. I had built my audience directly, person by person, letter by letter, which meant the studio could not take the audience away from me when it decided it was done with me. They could take the contract, they could take the films, they could take the whole apparatus they had built around the name they had given me. But the audience was mine, and the studio would decide it was done with me. That much I had always known. They always do. Everyone's commercial value expires eventually. That is the mathematics of the industry, as certain as any other kind, and the only question is what you have built that the studio cannot take with it when it walks away. I had built that. The audience was mine. More deliberately. But there were other things I built in those years that were less clean in the construction. Alliances, the kind that required maintenance, the kind that required attention to what was being said about you in rooms you were not in, by people whose goodwill you needed, and whose enmity you could not afford. Information was the currency of old Hollywood. Everyone knew this. The smart ones operated accordingly. The less smart ones discovered it when the information had already done its damage. I was very smart. I understood who was talking to whom and what the value of different relationships was in different contexts. I understood which conversations were more important than they appeared to be, and which appeared important but could be safely ignored. I understood the system, not with the resigned understanding of someone who knows they are trapped in it, with the operational understanding of someone who intends to use it. I want to be honest about the system, not the version that gets told afterward, the version where the studio is the villain and the actresses are the victims of forces entirely beyond their control, passive sufferers inside a machine that was built to use them up, but the actual version. The studio system in old Hollywood was a machine, and machines are not moral or immoral, they are operational, you could be processed by the machine. Shaped and managed and eventually discarded when the machine decided your commercial value had expired, which it would because machines decide this about everyone eventually, or you could learn to operate the machine. I learned to operate the machine. Information was the currency. Hollywood ran on information, on knowing what was happening in the rooms you were not in, on understanding the relationships and the vulnerabilities and the specific anxieties of the people whose decisions affected your career. The director who was fighting with the studio about the next picture's budget, that was useful information. The producer who was trying to move from one studio to another and needed a successful picture to make the case for himself, that was useful information. The actress whose contract was up for renewal and who was therefore more vulnerable than she appeared, that was useful information. I was very good at information. I understood who was talking to whom. I understood which stories, in which form, reaching which ears, would serve my interests and which would not. I understood how to be in the room where the useful conversations were happening. And I understood how to be useful in those conversations in ways that people remembered. This is not admirable. I want to be clear about that. I am not telling you this because I am proud of it. I am telling you because the alternative, the version where I operated with complete ethical purity inside a system that was designed to exploit and discard me, produced a predictable outcome for the women who tried it. I watched those women. I saw what happened to them. They were talented, they were principled, they were also gone. And I made my choices accordingly. There were specific tactics. The guest list for a party that could be adjusted to include people who needed to meet each other for reasons that benefited me. The photograph that got to the right publication at the right moment to shift a conversation that had been going in the wrong direction. The specific information released in the specific form about a specific person that redirected attention from whatever was currently aimed at me towards something more interesting and less damaging. I used all of these, without apology, with the clear-eyed understanding that I was operating in a system that would use these tactics against me whether I used them or not, that the choice was not between a clean game and a dirty one, but between playing the game and being played by it. I was not going to be played by it. I need to tell you about the other one. I am not going to name her. She knows who she is, or she knew in the years when we occupied the same industry at the same level, and the hatred between us was the worst kept secret in a town built entirely on secrets. And the reason I will not name her is not protection. Neither of us needs protection. Neither of us ever needed protection. It is that naming her would make this a story about two women, and it is not a story about two women. It is a story about a system that needed two women to hate each other and got exactly what it needed. With dark, genuine humor. She was talented. I will say that here, on the record, clearly and without qualification, she was talented. Whatever else I have said about her, and I have said a great deal about her in various contexts and moods across several decades, the talent was real, genuine, documented, visible on screen in a way that I could recognize because I had the same thing and knew what it looked like. But talent was not the issue between us. The issue was simpler and older than talent. There was only so much room at the top. Everyone in the industry understood this. The studio understood this. The press understood this. The audiences, in their way, understood it too. Not analytically, but instinctively, the way audiences understand the grammar of attention and who is getting how much of it. And neither of us was willing to take less of it so the other could have more. The humor giving way to something more honest. The hatred was real. I want to say that directly because there is a version of this story that reduces what existed between us to professional rivalry. Two ambitious women competing for the same roles in the same system at the same time. The conflict explicable entirely through the logic of competition. That version is technically accurate and entirely insufficient. What existed between us was something more complete, more personal, more specific, more satisfying in the way that only a truly reciprocal hatred can be satisfying, because she hated me back with the same precision and commitment that I brought to hating her. We were, in this way, perfectly matched. The studio understood this. The studio, and I say this with full appreciation of the cynicism involved, found the situation useful. Two major stars in active, documented, publicly known conflict generated coverage. Coverage generated interest. Interest generated ticket sales. The hatred was, in a sense, a business arrangement that neither of us had agreed to, but both of us had contributed to, and neither of us was willing to end. Because ending it would have required one of us to be the one who stepped back. And neither of us stepped back. This is the part I find most interesting, looking back at it now from the distance of everything that came after. Not the hatred itself, which was genuine and which I understand, but the specific dynamic of two people who each believed they were protecting themselves from the other when what they were actually doing was feeding a machine that was feeding on both of them. There was a film, late in both our careers, later than either of us would have chosen, under circumstances that neither of us would have predicted when we were the biggest names in Hollywood. We made a film together. I will not tell you everything that happened on that set. I will tell you this. The performance I gave in that film is one of the best performances of my career. And the reason it is one of the best, the specific quality it has, the rawness that audiences responded to, the thing that made the film something more than the exploitation picture the studio intended it to be, is genuine. It was not acting. I want to tell you about the fear. Not because I enjoy telling you about it. I don't, and if there were a way to tell this story honestly without it, I would have found that way long ago. But because the monument makes no sense without the fear that built it. The fear was simple. The same fear that every actress in the Hollywood system carried, that was built into the system as a feature, not a flaw, because fear is a very effective management tool, and the people who ran the studios understood management. The fear of replacement, of the next one. The younger face, the newer commodity. The girl who is everything you were 10 years ago, hungry, ambitious, willing to do what needs to be done, willing to work at a pace and a standard that the body sustains more easily when it is 10 years younger, and who is also 10 years younger. I watched this happen to women who were, at one point, where I was, at the top, certain, the name above the title, the face that sold the picture, the actress that the studio had built its programming around for half a decade, and then the studio found the next name for above the title, and the previous name was moved to below, and then off the title entirely, and then the films got smaller, and then the films stopped, and those women of genuine talent, women who had given the best years of their professional lives to a studio that had used those years and moved on from them, those women had to decide what to do with everything that came after. Some of them handled it with more grace than I would have managed. I know this about myself. But grace was not what had kept me at the top for as long as I had stayed there. I was more afraid than I have ever admitted. The obsession with control, with the body, with the image, with the information network, with the relentless management of every variable that could be managed. It was not confidence. I want to say that clearly. People looked at me and saw confidence. I had constructed confidence with the same care I had constructed everything else. The posture, the face, the public image. And it read on screen and in rooms as the real thing. It was not the real thing. The confidence was what I showed. The terror was what drove it. The terror that one morning I would arrive on set and understand, from the way the room changed when I walked in, that the room had changed, that the calculation had shifted, that the studio had found the next one and was no longer organizing itself around my commercial value but around hers. That terror lived in me every single day of the career, from the first contract to the last. It never left. And the exhaustion of managing it, of maintaining that level of vigilance every day for decades, of never allowing the performance to slip, of never giving the system the gap it was always looking for. That exhaustion accumulated into something I still do not have entirely the right word for. The major studio released me. They use the language studios use when they are ending a relationship that is no longer profitable. The language of mutual agreement, of creative differences, of the natural conclusion of a long and productive partnership. The underlying language was simpler. My commercial value in the studio's calculation no longer justified the investment required to maintain it. I was in my early 40s, and the machine that I'd spent 20 years learning to operate had decided with the specific institutional indifference of machine that it was done with me. I was not done. I want to be very clear about that. I found a new studio. I demanded the roles I wanted. I read scripts with the same analytical attention I had brought to everything, identifying the role that would require exactly the qualities I had, that could not be done by whoever the industry was currently positioning as my replacement. That would require the specific combination of technique and presence and hard-earned authority that only comes from the kind of career I had built. I found that role. I fought harder for it than I had fought for anything, and I made the picture. And the picture won me an Academy Award. I want you to hold that. Released as finished, as a commercial proposition no longer worth investing in, and within 2 years, an Academy Award. The machine was not infallible. I had always known the machine was not infallible. That was the only useful thing about the fear. It had forced me to prepare for exactly this moment, to have something in reserve, to not have given everything to the studio's version of my career without keeping something back for my own. But the machine was patient, and I was not, after the award, restored to the position I had held before. The industry celebrated the win. The industry mentioned my name in the articles about comeback stories, the narrative that Hollywood loves about people it has discarded who forced their way back in. And then the industry went back to what it had been doing before I interrupted it. The roles I wanted were not the roles being offered. The studio that had released me was now willing to work with me again, on its terms, with its films, in the positions it had decided I occupied now, which were not the positions I had occupied before. And the years passed, and the films got darker and stranger, and smaller in budget, but not, I would argue, in ambition or in quality. There is a kind of film that only a certain kind of actress can make. The kind of actress who's been through enough that the camera can see it. That there is no amount of technique that could simulate what the eyes communicate when they have actually lived something close to what the character is experiencing. I made those films. I am not ashamed of them. The industry was. The industry found those films uncomfortable in the specific way that industries find uncomfortable. Any evidence that the women they discard continue to be extraordinary in the circumstances of the discarding. I found the industry's discomfort less interesting than the work. The apartment was immaculate. It was always immaculate. This is not new information. Anyone who knew me in any period of my life could tell you that. But in the later years, the immaculate apartment was less a standard and more a project. Something to organize, something to control, something that responded to effort and attention in the reliable way that the industry had stopped responding, that the telephone had stopped responding, that the film offers had stopped responding, that the whole elaborate apparatus of a career that had required 50 people to maintain had stopped responding because those 50 people had found other projects and other names to build around. I was still the woman I had built. That is important to understand. I did not stop being her when the cameras stopped. I did not relax the posture. I did not abandon the standards that had produced the career. I did not allow the performance to become less than it had always been simply because the audience for it had become smaller and more private. I still received people correctly, still dressed for every occasion as though the cameras were present, and the image was being managed, and the publicity department was watching to see whether I gave them something useful. The cameras were not present. The image was not being managed. The publicity department had moved on to other clients. But the performance continued, because it was no longer a performance. It had been a performance once. The deliberate, constructed, carefully maintained identity of a woman who had decided what she would be and had executed that decision with the discipline of a professional. But 40 years of a performance eventually becomes something else. Eventually, the performance and the performer are no longer distinguishable. Eventually, the monument is the only version of the person that either of them can access. The relationships were complicated. I am not going to tell you that I was easy to know. I was not easy to know. The same qualities that had built the career, the control, the precision, the intolerance for anything that fell below the standard I required, those qualities did not make a person easy to know. They made a person formidable, admired, feared, respected, written about, studied, held at a distance that felt like reverence and functioned like a wall. The marriages, I had several, as the record shows, encountered the wall at various points and in various ways, and none of them finally found a way through it. Not because I didn't want them to. I want to be honest about that. I wanted them to. I wanted someone to find a way through to whoever was still there behind the monument I had built. The girl who had decided very early that survival required complete reinvention, and tell her that the survival was complete, that she could stop now, that the building was done. No one told her that, or they tried and she didn't hear them, or she heard them and couldn't trust it. Or the truth is more complicated and less narratively satisfying than that, which is usually the truth. And what actually happened is that I could not turn it off. The vigilance, the management, the constant, exhausting, never completed work of being the person I had decided to be. I could not turn it off, even in the room, even at the end of the day, even with no cameras and no audience and no industry calculating my commercial value and no rival positioning herself to take whatever I had. The performance continued, because I had performed it for so long that I could no longer find the place where it ended and I began. There is a mirror in the final act of every story like mine, not metaphorical, an actual mirror in an actual room at a time when the light is not flattering and the performance has been running long enough that even the most disciplined performer begins to see the gaps. I looked in the mirror. I saw the face I had built, the architecture of it, the choices that had gone into it across decades, the management and the maintenance and the specific quality of determination that shows in a face that has decided what it will be and has held that decision against everything that tried to change it. I saw the monument. I saw exactly what I had set out to build when I was a girl in a small town, watching people who had what I wanted and deciding with total clarity that I would have it. I had it. I had all of it, the career, the photographs, the name and the histories of the industry, the performances on celluloid that will exist as long as film exists, the specific, permanent, irrevocable fact of a woman who arrived with nothing and built something that is still standing long after the industry that tried to discard her has itself been fundamentally transformed. I had all of it. And behind the monument, just barely, at an angle that required a specific quality of light, I saw the girl I had buried, the one from before the second birth. The one who had watched and studied and decided that survival required complete reinvention. The one who had been the raw material of the architect. The one whose fear had built the monument and whose silence had maintained it and who had been throughout present, waiting, with the specific patience of someone who has nowhere else to go and all the time in the world. She was still there. She had been there the whole time. And I looked at her, the way you look at someone you have not seen in a very long time and are not entirely certain you recognize. And I understood something I had been too busy surviving to understand before. I won the war against Hollywood. I want to be clear about that. I survived everything the system designed to end me. I outlasted studios and contracts and trends and replacements and the specific institutional cruelty of an industry that uses people and then discards them and then is surprised when the people it discarded have something to say about it. I won. But look at the battlefield. I am the only thing left standing. And I am made of stone. And the girl I built the monument to protect, the one from before the second birth, the one whose fear made the monument necessary, she is still in there, still waiting, still not certain the survival is complete.